Picture this. You're 32, running your own concrete business in a world that still thinks women can't handle heavy machinery. And you've just met a woman who makes you question everything you thought you knew about starting over. Then, she looks you straight in the eye and asks the one question that changes everything. I'm 50. Age is just a number for marriage, right? I'm Emma Rodriguez, and what started as a simple driveway repair job turned into something I never saw coming. This is the story of how cracked concrete led to something beautiful, how a neighborhood tried to tear us apart, and how sometimes the most unexpected connections happen when you're just trying to do your job. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tuesday morning started the way most of my mornings did that spring. My phone buzzing at 5:30 with a text from my business partner Marcus about a supply delay, cold coffee in a travel mug that had seen better days, and the familiar weight of my work boots hitting the kitchen floor of my cramped apartment. I'd been running Rodriguez & Sons Construction for 3 years now, ever since Dad passed and left me his tools and a business loan that kept me awake most nights. The irony of the name wasn't lost on me. There were no sons, just me, but changing it felt like erasing him entirely. I grabbed my thermos, checked my tool inventory for the third time that week, and headed out to my pickup truck. The morning air in Riverside carried that hint of spring warmth that made everything feel possible, even at dawn. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, waved from her garden where she was already wrestling with what appeared to be a very stubborn tomato plant. At 78, she had more energy than most people half her age, and absolutely no filter when it came to commenting on my dating, life or lack thereof. "Emma, mija," she called out. "You work too much. When are you going to find a nice person and settle down?" I laughed, loading my equipment into the truck bed. "When I find someone who doesn't mind concrete dust in their morning coffee, Mrs. Chen." She shook her head disapprovingly. "You young people, always making excuses." The drive to Maplewood Heights took me through the older part of town, past the community college where I'd studied business management in night classes, past the diner where Marcus and I planned our weekly projects over mediocre pancakes, and into the kind of neighborhood where people actually knew their neighbors' names. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained lawns, and that particular suburban quiet that spoke of morning routines and weekend barbecues. Oakwood Drive sat nestled in the heart of it all, a curved street where every house seemed to have its own personality. Some were pristine with manicured gardens and pressure-washed driveways. Others showed the comfortable wear of families who actually lived in them rather than just displayed them. Number 47 was somewhere in between, a charming two-story, colonial with butter yellow siding and window boxes that looked recently planted, but not quite settled yet. The driveway, however, was a different story entirely. 20 feet of cracked concrete that told the tale of decades of harsh winters, poor drainage, and what appeared to be complete neglect. Oil stains formed abstract patterns across the surface, and the expansion joints had separated so dramatically that weeds had taken up residence in the gaps. It was the kind of project that made some contractors walk away, but I'd always found something satisfying about taking something broken and making it beautiful again. I was unloading my level when I heard the sound of creative cursing coming from the front yard. Following the voice, I discovered a woman kneeling beside a sprinkler head, wielding a wrench with the determination of someone who refused to be defeated by inanimate objects. She wore faded jeans with honest dirt stains, a oversized flannel, shirt rolled up to her elbows, and a baseball cap that read, "World's Okayest Mom," in cheerful yellow letters. Her hair, a rich brown with natural silver threads catching the morning light, escaped from under the cap in soft waves that suggested she'd been at this particular battle for a while. When she looked up at the sound of my truck door closing, I was struck by the kind of face that spoke of someone who laughed often and meant it. Laugh lines radiated from eyes the color of warm honey, and there was something immediately approachable about her expression, even while she was clearly frustrated with her irrigation system. "You must be Emma," she said, pushing herself up from the ground and wiping her hands on a shop rag that had seen better days. "Please tell me you're here to rescue me from this mechanical nightmare, because I'm about 2 minutes away from declaring war on this entire sprinkler system." I couldn't help but smile. Most of my clients were either overly formal or treated me like the help, but there was something refreshingly direct about her approach. "That's me, though I specialize more in concrete than irrigation." I'm afraid your sprinkler system is safe from my expertise. She laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to come easily. Fair enough. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and welcome to my ongoing battle with everything mechanical in this house. She gestured toward the driveway with a theatrical flourish. Though I'm hoping you'll have better luck with that disaster than I'm having with this one. We shook hands, and I noticed immediately that hers were the hands of someone who wasn't afraid of work. Calloused palms, strong grip, with traces of what looked like paint under her fingernails. They were honest hands, the kind that belonged to someone who fixed their own problems and didn't apologize for the wear and tear that came with it. Walking over to survey the driveway together, I could see why she'd called for help. The damage was extensive but not irreparable, the kind of project that would require completely removing the old surface and starting fresh. It would take the better part of a week, maybe longer if we ran into drainage issues underneath. I know it's probably a bigger job than you expected, Sarah said, following my gaze across the cracked expanse. The previous owners, apparently, believed in the power of positive thinking over actual maintenance. I've been here 3 months and I'm still discovering all the creative ways they avoided fixing things. I knelt down to test the stability of one section, feeling the concrete shift slightly under pressure. It's definitely seen better days, but nothing that can't be fixed. We'll need to remove all of this and start from scratch. Make sure the base is properly prepared this time. Are you planning to stay in the house long enough to make it worth the investment? Something shifted in her expression, a momentary vulnerability that she quickly covered with a smile. This is it for me. My forever house. Or at least that's the plan. After my divorce finalized last year, I wanted something that was completely mine, you know? Something I could fix up and make exactly what I wanted without having to compromise or ask permission. There was something in the way she said it that spoke of hard-won independence, of someone who had spent too long making decisions based on what other people wanted. I understood that feeling more than I cared to admit. Building my own business had been partly about proving I could do it, but mostly about never having to ask someone else for permission to work late or take on challenging projects. I get that, I said, standing and brushing concrete dust off my hands. There's something to be said for having a space that's entirely yours to mess up or improve as you see fit. Sarah's smile became more genuine. Exactly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Though I have to admit, some days I wonder if I bit off more than I can chew. Yesterday, I spent 2 hours trying to figure out why the garbage disposal sounds like it's grinding rocks, only to discover the previous owners had been putting coffee grounds down there for apparently years. Coffee grounds are actually one of the worst things for disposals, I said without thinking, then caught myself. Sorry, occupational hazard. I tend to diagnose everyone's house problems whether they ask or not. Please, diagnose away. I can use all the free advice I can get. I'm discovering that home ownership as a single person is like a full-time education in things I never knew I didn't know. As I began setting up my equipment and measuring the space, Sarah continued working on her sprinkler system, though I noticed she kept glancing over at what I was doing. There was a curiosity about her that felt different from the usual client oversight. Most people either hovered anxiously or disappeared entirely until the work was done. But Sarah seemed genuinely interested in the process. Can I ask you something? She said after I'd been working for about 20 minutes. How did you get into concrete work? It's not exactly a typical career path, especially for women. I paused in my measurements, considering how much of the story to tell. My dad owned this business before me. I grew up spending summers on job sites, learning to mix concrete before I could properly ride a bike. When he got sick 5 years ago, I started helping him manage the administrative side, and after he passed, I just sort of inherited everything. That must have been incredibly difficult, Sarah said quietly. Losing him and taking over the business at the same time. It was, I admitted, surprised by how easily the words came. There were days I thought about selling everything and finding a nice, safe office job somewhere. But then I'd finish a project and see how happy it made the clients, and I'd remember why Dad loved this work so much. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. There's something to be said for work that leaves a visible mark on the world. I teach high school art, and some days I feel like I'm just shouting into the void, hoping something sticks with the kids. But when you finish a driveway or a sidewalk, people can see exactly what you've accomplished. What made you choose teaching? I asked, genuinely curious about this woman who seemed to approach every conversation with thoughtful attention. Honestly, I fell into it the same way you fell into concrete work. I was an art major in college, had grand plans of being a painter, but life had other ideas. Got married young, needed steady income, and teaching seemed like a way to stay connected to art while actually paying the bills. She paused in her work with the sprinkler head. Though I have to say, after 23 years of teenagers, I've developed a pretty high tolerance for chaos and attitude. I bet that comes in handy. Dealing with contractors too, I said with a grin. She laughed. You have no idea. Last month I had a guy come to give me an estimate on bathroom tile who spent 15 minutes explaining to me why my color choices were impractical for resale value. I told him I wasn't planning to resell anytime soon and asked if he could install tile or just critique design decisions. Let me guess, he couldn't actually install tile? Turned out he was more of a sales guy than an actual installer. Lesson learned about getting multiple opinions and asking the right questions up front. I found myself genuinely enjoying the conversation in a way that rarely happened with clients. Usually, our interactions were purely functional. Project, scope, timeline, cost, completion. But Sarah seemed interested in the human side of the work, in understanding not just what I was doing, but why I chose to do it. The morning passed quickly as I completed my initial assessment and began the demolition process. Sarah brought out iced tea around 10:30, real tea with mint from what appeared to be a thriving herb garden beside her front steps. The gesture was simple but thoughtful, and I found myself looking forward to the brief breaks when we'd chat about everything from her students' latest artistic disasters to my ongoing battle with supply chain delays. Mind if I ask you something that might be too personal? Sarah said during one of these breaks, settling onto her front steps with her own glass of tea. I looked up from where I was marking sections for removal. Shoot. Are you married? Do you have family in the area? She immediately looked embarrassed. Sorry, that came out wrong. I'm not interviewing you for anything weird. I just realized I've been monopolizing your morning with my sprinkler drama, and I don't know anything about your life outside of concrete and inherited businesses. The question caught me off guard, partly because it was personal, but mostly because of how she'd asked it. There was no agenda behind it, just genuine curiosity about me as a person, rather than a service provider. Not married, I said, returning to my marking. I was engaged a few years ago, but it turns out that dating someone who thinks your career is cute but temporary isn't a recipe for long-term happiness. Ouch. Let me guess, he had plans for your future that didn't include concrete dust and early morning job sites? Something like that. He was a financial advisor, very focused on image and what looked successful to other people. My work embarrassed him, especially when we'd run into his colleagues and he'd have to explain what I did for a living. Sarah made a disgusted sound. What an absolute waste of space. Anyone who's embarrassed by honest work and actual skill doesn't deserve 5 minutes of your time, let alone years of it. The vehemence in her voice surprised me, and I looked up to find her expression genuinely angry on my behalf. It had been a long time since someone had been indignant about how I'd been treated, and something warm settled in my chest at her immediate protective response. Well, it worked out for the best, I said. I probably wouldn't have taken over the business if I'd been worried about maintaining his idea of an appropriate lifestyle. And honestly, I like my life better now than I did when I was trying to fit into someone else's vision of what it should look like. Good for you, Sarah said firmly. Life's too short to spend it pretending to be someone you're not just to make other people comfortable. There was something in the way she said it that suggested personal experience, and I found myself wondering about her own story, the divorce she'd mentioned, the emphasis on having a space that was entirely hers, the way she'd talked about asking permission for her own decisions. It painted a picture of someone who had spent considerable time accommodating other people's expectations. What about you? I asked. Kids? Family chaos? You mentioned being divorced, but I don't want to pry if it's complicated. Sarah's expression softened into something that looked like fond exasperation. 2 kids, both in college and both absolutely convinced they're smarter than their mother. Jessica's studying engineering at State and Michael's at art school in Portland, pursuing what he calls multimedia installations and what I call very expensive ways to confuse people. Sounds like they get their creativity from you. And their stubbornness, unfortunately. They're both incredible kids, but they've definitely inherited my tendency to argue with authority figures and question everything. She paused, shadow crossing her face. The divorce was hard on them, especially since it happened during Jessica's senior year of high school. But they've been amazingly supportive of me buying this place and starting over. Starting over at 50 takes guts, I said, meaning it. A lot of people would just settle for whatever they had, even if it wasn't making them happy. Sarah looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Is 50 really starting over, though? Sometimes I feel like I'm just finally becoming who I was supposed to be all along. Like the first 25 years of marriage were just an extended dress rehearsal for my actual life. There was something vulnerable about the admission, and I found myself drawn into the conversation in a way that felt both professional and deeply personal. Here was a woman who had clearly made difficult choices and was still figuring out what came next, much like I had been doing since taking over the business. I think there's something to be said for coming into your own later in life, I said carefully. You know more about what you actually want versus what you think you're supposed to want. Exactly, Sarah said, her face lighting up. When I was younger, I made so many decisions based on what looked right or what other people expected. This house, this life, it's the first time I've chosen something purely because it felt right to me. As the day progressed, and I continued the demolition work, our conversations became more natural and wide-ranging. Sarah worked in her garden while I worked on her driveway, and we talked about everything from her students' latest artistic breakthroughs to my ongoing efforts to expand the business beyond basic residential work. There was something comfortable about the rhythm we fell into, working in parallel while maintaining an easy flow of conversation. It reminded me of working alongside my father on summer jobs, that sense of shared purpose and mutual respect that made even difficult work feel lighter. By late afternoon, I had made significant progress on removing the damaged sections of concrete, and Sarah had apparently won her battle with the sprinkler system. We were both tired, dusty, and satisfied with our respective accomplishments when she made an observation that caught me completely off guard. "You know, Emma," she said, wiping her hands on her jeans and surveying the day's work, "I have to ask you something, and I hope it doesn't sound completely crazy." I looked up from where I was cleaning my tools, suddenly aware that her tone had shifted to something more serious. "I'm 50 years old," she continued, her voice steady but with an undertone of something that might have been nervousness. "I've been married, I've raised kids, I've had what most people would call a complete life. But lately, I've been wondering about things I never let myself wonder about before." She paused, and I found myself holding my breath, sensing that whatever came next would be important. Age is just a number for marriage, right? I mean, if someone wanted to start completely over, to build something real with someone who actually saw them and appreciated them for who they are, 50 wouldn't be too late for that, would it? The question hung in the air between us, loaded, with possibility and vulnerability in equal measure. Sarah wasn't looking directly at me, but there was something in her posture that suggested this wasn't entirely hypothetical, that my answer mattered more than simple curiosity would warrant. I set down my tools carefully, aware that whatever I said next would shape not just this conversation, but potentially everything that came after it. Here was a woman who had clearly summoned considerable courage to ask such a personal question, and she deserved a thoughtful, honest response. "I think," I said slowly, "that the right person would see 50 as someone who knows exactly what she wants and isn't afraid to go after it. Someone who's lived enough to know the difference between what looks good and what actually is good." Sarah's shoulders relaxed slightly, and when she finally met my eyes, there was something like relief in her expression. "That's a very diplomatic answer," she said with a small smile. "It's also an honest one," I replied, "though I have to admit, I'm curious about what prompted the question." Sarah laughed, but it sounded a little shaky. "Would you believe me if I said it was purely theoretical?" "I'd believe whatever you wanted to tell me," I said. "But I'd also say that purely theoretical questions usually don't require that much courage to ask." We looked at each other across the partially demolished driveway, and I felt the distinct sense that we were standing at the edge of something that could change everything. The practical part of my brain reminded me that Sarah was a client, that mixing business with personal feelings was usually a recipe for disaster, that I barely knew this woman despite feeling like we'd been having meaningful conversations all day. But there was another part of me, a part that had been dormant since my engagement ended, that recognized something rare and valuable in the woman standing before me. Sarah Mitchell was clearly someone who thought deeply about life, who approached relationships with intentionality rather than convenience, who had the courage to ask difficult questions even when she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answers. "For what it's worth," I said finally. "I think anyone lucky enough to build something real with you wouldn't be focused on numbers. They'd be focused on how remarkable it is to find someone who approaches life with such thoughtfulness and courage." Sarah's smile became more genuine, and some of the tension I hadn't realized I was carrying in my shoulders began to ease. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for the honest answer, and for not making me feel foolish for asking." "Never foolish," I assured her. "Brave, maybe, but definitely not foolish." As I finished loading my tools and prepared to leave for the day, I found myself already looking forward to returning tomorrow. And not just because the project was interesting. Sarah Mitchell had managed to surprise me in the space of a single day, challenging assumptions I didn't even realize I had about clients, about age differences, about the possibility of unexpected connections. Driving home through the familiar streets of Riverside, I caught myself thinking about the question she'd asked and the way she'd asked it. There had been something both vulnerable and determined about her approach, as if she'd been working up the courage for quite some time to voice something that mattered deeply to her. The practical part of my brain insisted on cataloging all the reasons why getting involved with a client was complicated, why the age difference might matter more than I wanted to admit, why I barely knew her despite feeling an unusual connection. But there was another voice, quieter but more insistent, that kept returning to the honesty in her eyes and the way she'd approached every conversation with genuine interest and respect. Whatever was developing between us, it felt like something worth exploring carefully and thoughtfully. Sarah Mitchell had already proven herself to be someone who brought considerable depth and intentionality to her interactions, and I found myself curious about what might develop if we continued getting to know each other beyond the professional boundaries of contractor and client. The next morning would bring new challenges and new conversations, and I suspected that the foundation we were building together might turn out to be about much more than just concrete and proper drainage. Sometimes the most important construction projects are the ones you don't see coming. The ones that start with simple questions and honest answers and grow into something neither person expected, but both are brave enough to build together. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of drizzle that made concrete work impossible but perfect for equipment maintenance and planning. I spent the early hours in my garage workshop, cleaning tools and thinking about Sarah's question from the day before. The practical side of me had spent half the night listing all the reasons why getting involved with a client was professionally unwise, while another part of me kept returning to the genuine warmth in her voice and the courage it must have taken to ask such a vulnerable question. By 10 o'clock, the rain had stopped, and I decided to head over to Oakwood Drive to assess the moisture levels and plan the next phase of work. What I found when I arrived was Sarah standing in her front yard, hands on her hips, staring at what appeared to be the remains of a patio furniture set scattered across her lawn, like abstract art installations. "Please tell me you have experience with furniture assembly," she called out when she saw me climbing out of my truck. "Because I'm starting to think these instructions were written by someone who speaks a language that exists only in furniture factories." I walked over to survey the chaos, noting the various pieces of what looked like it might eventually become a bistro table and 2 chairs, provided someone could decode the hieroglyphic assembly guide that lay crumpled beside Sarah's feet. "Let me guess," I said, picking up one of the instruction sheets. "Step 1 seemed reasonable, Step 2 was confusing, and by Step 3 you were questioning your life choices?" Sarah laughed, pushing a strand of hair back from her face. "Step 1 was fine. Step 2 involves something called a reverse-threaded bolt connector that apparently doesn't exist in this reality. Step 3 made me wonder if furniture designers are actually aliens trying to test human intelligence." The morning sun had begun to break through the clouds, casting dappled light across the yard and highlighting the silver in Sarah's hair. She wore jeans and a soft blue sweater that brought out the honey color of her eyes, and there was something endearingly determined about her approach to the furniture disaster that made me want to help solve her problem. "Mind if I take a look?" I asked, kneeling down beside the scattered components. I've assembled my share of furniture over the years, usually for clients who discover that some assembly required means something different than they expected. "Be my guest," Sarah said, settling cross-legged on the grass beside me. "Though, I should warn you, this particular set has already defeated my neighbor Tom, my daughter Jessica when she called to help via video chat, and my own stubborn determination. Working through the assembly process gave us a chance to talk in a different way than we had the day before. Instead of the careful getting-to-know-you conversation of new acquaintances, we fell into the easy rhythm of two people solving a problem together. Sarah handed me tools before I asked for them, held pieces steady while I aligned connections, and provided commentary that kept me laughing even when the instructions proved as incomprehensible as she'd warned. "So, tell me about your daughter." "Jessica," I said, working on what the instructions optimistically called a simple pivot joint. "Engineering student, right? Does she get her mechanical aptitude from you?" Sarah snorted. "Jessica gets her mechanical aptitude from sheer force of will and YouTube tutorials. I, as you can clearly see, am much better with paintbrushes than power tools. Though she did inherit my tendency to argue with inanimate objects when they don't cooperate." "What's she studying specifically?" "Environmental engineering with a focus on sustainable infrastructure. She wants to design water treatment systems for developing communities." Sarah's voice carried obvious pride. "She's incredibly brilliant and completely determined to save the world through better plumbing." "That's amazing. Does she ever give you advice about your house projects?" "Constantly," Sarah said with fond exasperation. "Yesterday she sent me a 12-minute voice message about proper drainage solutions for the back garden, complete with technical terminology I had to look up afterward. She's convinced I need to install a rain garden and something called permeable pavement." I looked up from the bolt I was threading. "She's not wrong about the drainage. Your backyard slopes toward the house, and with the amount of rain we get here, you might want to consider some kind of water management system. See? This is why I like you already. You give practical advice without making me feel like an idiot for not knowing it already." The casual way she said, "I like you already," sent a small warm flutter through my chest, and I found myself focusing intently on the furniture assembly to hide the smile I couldn't quite suppress. There was something refreshing about Sarah's directness, the way she said exactly what she meant without games or hidden agendas. We worked in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of quiet that felt natural rather than awkward. I became aware of small details, the way Sarah hummed softly while concentrating, the careful attention she paid to organizing the small hardware pieces, the fact that she had paint under her fingernails in 3 different colors. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said eventually, her tone casual but with an undertone that suggested the question mattered. "Shoot." "Yesterday, when I asked about age and marriage, you gave a very thoughtful answer. But I realized I never asked what you actually think about relationships in general. Are you someone who believes in the possibility of finding the right person, or are you more of a skeptic?" The question caught me off guard, partly because it was personal, but mostly because it required me to articulate feelings I'd been avoiding examining too closely since my engagement ended. "I think," I said slowly, "that I used to believe in finding the right person. Then I got cynical for a while, and now I'm somewhere in between. I believe in the possibility, but I also think it requires 2 people who are willing to be honest about who they actually are, not who they think they should be." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "That's a mature perspective. What made you cynical?" I paused in my work, considering how much vulnerability to share with someone I'd known for exactly 2 days. But there was something about Sarah's genuine curiosity and her own willingness to ask difficult questions that made honesty feel safer than usual. "My ex-fiancé," I said finally. He fell in love with the idea of me rather than the actual me. He liked the novelty of dating someone with an unconventional job, but he expected me to eventually grow out of it and become someone more conventional. When it became clear that wasn't going to happen, things got complicated. "How long were you together?" 3 years. Long enough that I started questioning whether the problem was my unwillingness to compromise or his inability to accept who I actually was. I managed to connect two particularly stubborn pieces and felt a small surge of satisfaction. It took me a while after we broke up to realize that the right person doesn't require you to become someone else. That's a hard lesson to learn, Sarah said quietly. I spent most of my marriage trying to be the person my ex-husband wanted me to be, and I lost track of who I actually was in the process. The divorce was devastating, but it was also the first time in years I got to make decisions based purely on what I wanted. There was something raw in her admission that made me look up from the furniture assembly. Sarah was staring out across her yard, her expression thoughtful and a little sad. "Is that why you bought this house?" I asked. "To figure out who you are when you're not trying to be what someone else wants?" Sarah smiled, but it was tinged with something that looked like relief at being understood. "Exactly. This house, this neighborhood, even this ridiculous furniture that refuses to cooperate, it's all mine to figure out. For the first time in my adult life, I don't have to run my decisions past anyone else or worry about whether my choices align with someone else's vision of what our life should look like." We finished the bistro set assembly in thoughtful quiet, both of us, apparently, processing the weight of what we'd shared. When the last bolt was tightened and the chairs stood properly upright, Sarah clapped her hands together with genuine delight. "It's beautiful and functional." I was starting to think it was going to end up as very expensive garden art. I stood up, brushing grass off my knees and feeling satisfied with our collaborative problem solving. The key is ignoring about 60% of the instructions and using common sense for the rest. "I'll remember that for future furniture emergencies," Sarah said. "Can I offer you coffee as payment for your mechanical expertise? I promise it's significantly better than my furniture assembly skills." The coffee was indeed excellent, and we settled at the newly assembled bistro set to enjoy it. Sarah's back garden was larger than I'd initially realized, with established flower beds that showed signs of recent attention, and a lawn that would be beautiful once the spring growth really took hold. There was a small greenhouse near the back, fence that looked like a recent addition, and herb gardens planted in neat rows beside the kitchen window. "You've done a lot of work back here," I observed, noting the careful organization and obvious care that had gone into the landscaping. "Therapy gardening," Sarah said with a smile. "After the divorce, I needed something that would grow and change and respond to attention in positive ways. Plants seemed like a safer emotional investment than people for a while. And now I'm ready to consider that maybe people can be good investments too, under the right circumstances." The way she said it, looking directly at me over her coffee cup, sent that same warm flutter through my chest as her earlier comment about liking me. There was something happening between us that felt both gradual and inevitable, like we were building something real through these small, honest conversations. Before I could respond, the sound of a car door slamming interrupted the moment. Sarah's expression shifted to something that looked like mild annoyance mixed with resignation. "That'll be Margaret Walsh," she said, standing up. "My neighbor from across the street. She's been finding reasons to check on me since I moved in." A woman in her early 60s approached from the side yard carrying a clipboard and wearing the kind of determined expression that suggested official business. She was impeccably dressed in a way that spoke of someone who never left the house without considering what the neighbors might think. And her smile was the practiced kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sarah, dear," Margaret said, her gaze taking in the coffee setup and lingering on me with obvious curiosity. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Just enjoying coffee and admiring the newly assembled furniture," Sarah replied, pleasantly. "Margaret Walsh, this is Emma Rodriguez. She's handling the driveway renovation." Margaret's smile became slightly more strained. "Of course. I noticed the construction equipment yesterday. I trust you've checked with the Homeowners Association about permits and noise restrictions?" "All properly filed," I said, keeping my tone professional despite the subtle hostility in Margaret's demeanor. "The work is well within permitted hours, and we're taking care to minimize disruption to the neighborhood." "I'm sure," Margaret said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "It's just that some of us work from home and value the peaceful atmosphere that drew us to this neighborhood in the first place." Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The previous owners let the driveway deteriorate for years. I'm simply bringing the property up to appropriate standards." "Oh, I'm not criticizing," Margaret said quickly, though clearly she was. It's just important to maintain the community standards we've all worked so hard to establish. Some changes can affect property values for the entire street. The subtext was clear. Margaret disapproved of something about the situation, whether it was the construction work, my presence, or Sarah's general existence in the neighborhood. I'd encountered this type of neighbor before on other job sites, the kind of person who viewed any change as a personal affront to their carefully ordered world. "I appreciate your concern for the neighborhood," Sarah said, her voice maintaining its pleasant tone through what was clearly considerable self-control. "The driveway repair will be completed professionally, and will certainly improve rather than detract from the overall appearance of the street." Margaret's gaze shifted between Sarah and me, and I could practically see her mental calculations about our interaction and what it might mean for her perception of neighborhood propriety. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose as long as everything is properly permitted, though I do hope the work won't drag on too long. Construction projects have a way of expanding beyond their original scope." "Emma runs a very professional operation," Sarah said firmly. "I have complete confidence that the project will be completed on schedule and to the highest standards." The way Sarah defended my work and competence without hesitation or qualification did something warm and protective to my chest. Most clients treated contractors as necessary evils to be tolerated, but Sarah spoke about my work with genuine respect and confidence. After Margaret finally left, clutching her clipboard and looking vaguely dissatisfied with her inability to find anything genuinely objectionable, Sarah sank back into her chair with a sigh. "I'm sorry about that," she said. "Margaret seems to have appointed herself as the unofficial neighborhood watchdog. She's been looking for reasons to disapprove of me since I moved in. Any particular reason, or just general suspicion of newcomers?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "I think she's uncomfortable with the idea of a divorced woman living alone. She's made several comments about maintaining family-oriented community standards and asking whether I'm planning to have visitors regularly." Visitors. "I think she's worried I'm going to start dating and somehow corrupt the moral fiber of Oakwood Drive," Sarah said with dry humor. "Though given that Tom and Janet next door have parties every weekend, and the college students 3 houses down regularly have gatherings that last until 2 in the morning, I'm not sure what specifically about my lifestyle she finds threatening." I felt a surge of irritation on Sarah's behalf. The idea that a successful, independent woman would be viewed as somehow problematic simply because she didn't fit Margaret's narrow definition of appropriate neighbor behavior struck me as both absurd and infuriating. "For what it's worth," I said, "I think Margaret's definition of community standards is probably more about control than actual community well-being." "Thank you for saying that. Some days I wonder if I made a mistake moving to such a traditional neighborhood. But then I look at this garden and this house and remember that I bought this place for me, not for Margaret Walsh's approval." The rest of the morning passed quickly as I returned to work on the driveway preparation. The concrete had dried, enough from yesterday's rain that I could continue the demolition process, and Sarah busied herself with various garden projects that kept her within conversation range. What struck me most was how naturally we fell into a rhythm of parallel work and intermittent conversation. Sarah asked thoughtful questions about my process without getting in the way, and I found myself explaining techniques and decisions in more detail than I usually did with clients. She seemed genuinely interested in understanding not just what I was doing, but why specific approaches worked better than others. Around lunchtime, Sarah disappeared into the house and returned with sandwiches and more iced tea. The gesture was simple but thoughtful, and we ate sitting on her front steps, watching the neighborhood go about its midday routine. "Can I ask you something that might be too personal?" Sarah said, unwrapping her sandwich with careful attention. "You can ask me anything," I said, meaning it more than I'd expected to. "Yesterday you mentioned that your ex-fiancé was embarrassed by your work. How did that manifest? I'm trying to understand how someone could be embarrassed by skill and independence." The question hit closer to home than I'd anticipated, bringing back memories I'd worked hard to process and move beyond. But Sarah's genuine curiosity and the way she'd phrased the question, focusing on understanding rather than just satisfying nosiness, made me want to give her an honest answer. "It was subtle at first," I said slowly. "He'd introduce me as his fiancé without mentioning what I did for work. At social events, he'd steer conversations away from careers. When people asked directly, he'd make jokes about me being handy around the house, rather than acknowledging that I ran a legitimate business. Sarah's expression grew increasingly indignant as I continued. That sounds incredibly demeaning. It got worse over time. He started suggesting that once we were married, I could use my construction knowledge to help him flip houses as a side hobby while I found a real career. He honestly believed that what I did was just a phase I'd eventually outgrow. What a complete waste of oxygen, Sarah said with such vehemence that I almost choked on my sandwich. I cannot imagine being with someone who didn't recognize and celebrate your competence and success. The fierce loyalty in her voice surprised me. Here was someone who had known me for less than 48 hours, defending my worth and my choices with more conviction than my ex-fiancé had shown in 3 years of supposedly loving me. Thank you for saying that, I said. It took me a long time to stop questioning whether he might have been right, whether I was being stubborn about something that didn't really matter. Of course it matters, Sarah said firmly. What you do requires skill, knowledge, physical strength, business acumen, and problem-solving abilities. Anyone who can't see that is either incredibly stupid or deliberately blind. We finished lunch in comfortable quiet, both of us apparently processing the weight of what we'd shared. I found myself studying Sarah's profile as she looked out across the street, noting the determined set of her jaw and the thoughtful expression that seemed to be her default state. There was something deeply attractive about her combination of vulnerability and strength, the way she approached difficult topics with both courage and compassion. The afternoon brought new challenges as I discovered drainage issues beneath the old concrete that would require additional work to address properly. Sarah listened to my explanation of the problems and the solutions with the kind of attention most clients reserved for cost estimates, asking questions that showed she understood both the technical requirements and the implications for the project. Timeline. How long will the additional drainage work add to the project? She asked, kneeling beside me to examine the problematic area. Probably 2 extra days, I said. I want to install proper drainage tile and make sure the base is completely stable before we pour the new concrete. It's better to fix it right the first time than to have problems resurface in a few years. That makes sense, and honestly, I'm not in any hurry for you to finish. The way she said it, with a small smile that suggested multiple meanings, sent warmth spreading through my chest. We were both beginning to acknowledge, without directly stating it, that our connection went beyond the professional necessity of completing a driveway repair. By late afternoon, I had made significant progress on both the demolition and the drainage assessment. Sarah had continued her garden work, and we'd maintained our pattern of easy conversation interrupted by focused work periods. As I began cleaning, up for the day, I realized I was already looking forward to returning tomorrow, and not just because the project was professionally satisfying. Emma, Sarah said as I loaded my tools, her voice carrying that same slightly nervous undertone from the day before when she'd asked about age and marriage. Can I ask you something else? I turned to face her, noting the way she was fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. Of course. Tomorrow's Thursday, and I don't teach on Fridays this semester. Would you be interested in staying for dinner? Tomorrow after work? Nothing fancy, just a chance to talk without concrete dust and construction noise. The invitation was clearly significant for both of us, a step beyond the casual conversations we'd been having into something more intentionally social. I could see the courage it took for her to ask, the same vulnerability she'd shown when asking about marriage and second chances. I'd love that, I said, meaning it completely. Should I bring anything? Just yourself, Sarah said, her smile bright with relief and anticipation. And maybe an appetite for slightly experimental cooking. I'm still figuring out my new kitchen. Driving home that evening, I found myself thinking about the day's conversations and the gradual deepening of whatever was developing between Sarah and me. There was something rare about the way we communicated, the ease with which we'd begun, sharing vulnerable truths, and the genuine interest we showed in each other's perspectives and experiences. The practical part of my brain continued to catalog potential complications, the professional boundary issues, the age difference, the fact that we were both still figuring out who we were after difficult relationship endings. But there was another voice, stronger and more insistent, that recognized something valuable in Sarah Mitchell's honesty, intelligence, and courage. Whatever tomorrow's dinner might bring, I was beginning to understand that Sarah's question about age and second chances wasn't entirely theoretical. And increasingly, I was discovering that my own answer wasn't either. Thursday morning brought unseasonably warm weather and the kind of clear skies that made outdoor work feel less like labor and more like an excuse to spend time in the sunshine. I arrived at Sarah's house with my usual equipment plus a small bag containing the kind of work clothes that could transition to dinner appropriate without requiring a complete wardrobe change. The thought of staying for dinner had occupied more of my mental space than I cared to admit, bringing with it a flutter of anticipation, mixed with the particular nervousness that comes with stepping across the invisible line between professional and personal relationships. Sarah was already outside when I pulled up, this time engaged in what appeared to be a philosophical debate with a climbing rose that had overgrown its trellis support. She wore dark jeans and a soft green sweater that complemented her coloring, and her hair was pulled back in a way that looked effortlessly elegant, despite the fact that she was clearly prepared for garden work. "Morning," I called out, unloading my tools. "Winning the argument with the rose bush?" "The roses are staging a rebellion," she replied, wiping her hands on a gardening towel. "They've apparently decided that organized growth is a suggestion rather than a requirement. I'm trying to negotiate a compromise that doesn't involve heavy pruning in spring." I walked over to examine the situation, noting the vigorous but chaotic growth pattern. "Looks like they're testing boundaries. Sometimes plants do better with clear structure than with too much freedom." Sarah gave me a look that suggested the metaphor hadn't been lost on her. "Are we still talking about roses?" "Definitely roses," I said with a grin, though I suppose the principle applies more broadly. The morning passed quickly as I continued the drainage work beneath the old concrete foundation. The problems were more extensive than I'd initially realized, requiring careful excavation and the installation of additional drainage tile to prevent future water damage. It was detailed, technical work that required concentration, but Sarah's presence made even the tedious aspects feel more engaging. She worked in various parts of her garden while I focused on the underground infrastructure, but we maintained our pattern of intermittent conversation. She told me about her students' latest artistic projects, including one particularly ambitious junior who was attempting to recreate famous paintings using only recycled materials found in the school cafeteria. I shared stories about some of my more unusual client requests, including a woman who wanted her driveway to match the exact shade of her favorite lipstick. Around mid-morning, a car pulled into the driveway next door, and a couple emerged carrying grocery bags and what appeared to be party planning supplies. Sarah waved at them, and they walked over to chat, clearly comfortable with their neighbor in a way that contrasted sharply with Margaret Walsh's formal disapproval. "Emma, I'd like you to meet Tom and Janet Morrison," Sarah said, standing up from her rosebush negotiations. "They've been incredibly welcoming since I moved in. Tom and Janet, this is Emma Rodriguez, who's transforming my disaster of a driveway into something that won't embarrass me in front of the neighbors." Tom was a man in his late 50s with graying hair and the kind of easy smile that suggested someone who enjoyed life without taking it too seriously. Janet appeared to be roughly the same age, with laugh lines that spoke of someone who found humor in everyday situations and the confident bearing of someone comfortable in her own skin. "Nice to meet you," Tom said, shaking my hand with genuine warmth. "We've been wondering when Sarah would finally tackle that driveway. The previous owners let it get pretty rough." "Emma's discovered that the problems go deeper than just surface cracks," Sarah explained. "Apparently there are drainage issues that have been building up for years." Janet nodded knowingly. "That explains why our basement has been getting increasingly damp during heavy rains. We've been meaning to have someone look at the drainage situation for our whole section of the street." "It's pretty common in neighborhoods this age," I said. "Original drainage systems weren't always designed for current weather patterns, and tree root growth can disrupt underground systems over time." "Would you be interested in looking at our situation when you finish with Sarah?" Tom asked. "We'd love to work with someone who comes so highly recommended." The casual way he referenced Sarah's recommendation, as if her opinion carried weight and credibility, made something warm settle in my chest. It was a small thing, but it represented the kind of respect and trust that I'd learned not to take for granted in professional relationships. "I'd be happy to take a look," I said. "Though I should warn you that I'm pretty thorough about identifying problems. Sometimes people wish they hadn't asked once they know everything that needs attention." Janet laughed. Trust me, after 30 years of home ownership, we've learned that hidden problems don't get better by being ignored. We'd rather know what we're dealing with. After Tom and Janet headed inside with their groceries, Sarah and I returned to our respective work. But the interaction had added another layer to my understanding of her place in this neighborhood. Despite Margaret Walsh's disapproval, it was clear that Sarah had found genuine allies in her immediate neighbors, people who valued her company and respected her judgment. "They seem wonderful," I said, taking a break to hydrate and check my progress. "They've been lifesavers," Sarah agreed. "When I first moved in, Janet brought over a casserole and a bottle of wine, and Tom helped me figure out how to reset the circuit breaker when I overloaded the kitchen outlets trying to run too many appliances at once. Good neighbors can make all the difference in how comfortable you feel in a new place." Exactly. Though I have to admit, having supportive neighbors has made Margaret's disapproval easier to dismiss. It's hard to feel like a neighborhood pariah when Tom and Janet keep inviting me to barbecues and asking for my opinions on their garden planning. The subtext in her comment wasn't lost on me. Sarah was building a life in this community, establishing relationships and connections that went beyond mere proximity. The way she talked about her neighbors, with genuine affection and appreciation, spoke to someone who valued authentic relationships over superficial pleasantries. As the day progressed, I became increasingly aware of the approaching dinner invitation and the significance it represented for both of us. There was something different about the way Sarah moved around her property, a subtle energy that suggested anticipation mixed with the particular kind of nervous attention that comes with wanting to make a good impression on someone whose opinion matters. Around 3 o'clock, my concentration was interrupted by the arrival of a young woman who pulled up in a small sedan and approached with the confident stride of someone who belonged here. She was probably in her early 20s, with dark hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of direct gaze that suggested intelligence and determination. "Mom?" she called out, spotting Sarah among the rose bushes. "I thought I'd surprise you with a visit before heading back to campus." Sarah's face lit up with unmistakable delight. "Jessica, what are you doing here? Don't you have classes?" "My afternoon lecture was canceled, and I had something I wanted to show you," the young woman said, then noticed me working on the driveway. "You must be Emma. Mom's told me about the driveway project." I stood up, wiping my hands before extending one in greeting. "You must be Jessica. Your mom mentioned you're studying environmental engineering." Jessica's handshake was firm and confident. "That's right. And actually, that's partly why I'm here. I wanted to see what kind of drainage solutions you're implementing. Mom said you discovered some significant problems with the original system." For the next 20 minutes, Jessica examined my work with the kind of technical knowledge that made it clear she understood both the problems I'd identified and the solutions I was implementing. Her questions were specific and informed, and she offered several observations about long-term maintenance and potential improvements that showed she'd inherited her mother's thoughtfulness, along with a solid foundation in engineering principles. "This is really impressive work," she said finally, standing up from where she'd been examining the drainage tile installation. "You're not just fixing the immediate problems, you're creating a system that should handle much heavier water loads than the original design. Your mom mentioned that you recommended rain gardens and permeable pavement," I said. "You're absolutely right about the need for better water management in this neighborhood." Jessica's face brightened. "Exactly. The whole street could benefit from coordinated stormwater management. Individual solutions help, but neighborhood-wide planning would be much more effective." Watching Jessica and Sarah interact, I could see where the younger woman had gotten her confidence and intellectual curiosity. There was an easy affection between them, but also genuine respect for each other's opinions and capabilities. Sarah clearly took pride in her daughter's expertise, while Jessica seemed to value her mother's practical wisdom and life experience. "Are you staying for dinner?" Sarah asked her daughter, and I caught the subtle glance in my direction that suggested the evening's plans might need adjustment. "Actually, I can't," Jessica said. "I'm meeting some classmates for a study group at 6, and I need to drive back to campus. But I wanted to drop off the research I mentioned on sustainable landscaping options for your back garden." She handed Sarah a folder thick with printed articles and what appeared to be hand-drawn diagrams. "I've been thinking about your space, and I have some ideas for native plantings that would complement your drainage improvements and provide habitat for local wildlife." The thoughtfulness of the gesture, the time and research Jessica had clearly invested in helping her mother create exactly the kind of environment she wanted, spoke to the depth of their relationship and the respect Jessica had for her mother's independence and decision-making abilities. After Jessica left, promising to call later in the week to discuss the landscaping ideas in more detail, Sarah and I found ourselves alone again with the subtle tension that had been building throughout the day. The dinner invitation, which had felt natural and comfortable when extended, now carried the weight of transition from professional to personal interaction. "I should probably clean up and call it a day," I said, though it was still relatively early by my usual standards. "Give you time to prepare whatever culinary experiment you have planned." Sarah smiled, but there was something nervous in her expression. "Actually, about dinner. I hope you don't mind something simple. I realized after I invited you that I might have oversold my cooking abilities." "I'm sure whatever you make will be wonderful," I said, meaning it. "Besides, after spending the day working outside, anything that doesn't require me to cook it myself sounds like luxury. In that case, you're in for a treat. Or at least an adventure." I spent the next hour finishing up the drainage work and organizing my tools for the following day. Sarah disappeared into the house, presumably to begin dinner preparations, though I could hear occasional sounds of mild frustration drifting through the open kitchen windows that suggested the cooking process was proving as challenging as she'd anticipated. When she emerged to invite me inside at 6:30, she looked slightly frazzled but pleased with herself. She'd changed into a soft blue dress that brought out her eyes and made her look both elegant and approachable, and the scent of something delicious wafted from the kitchen. "Fair warning," she said as I followed her through the front door. "The recipe claimed to be foolproof, but I think I may have outsmarted it." The interior of Sarah's house was as thoughtfully arranged as her garden, with comfortable furniture that looked lived in rather than designed for display, and walls covered with what appeared to be a combination of her own artwork and pieces created by her students. The overall effect was warm and welcoming, the kind of space that invited conversation and lingered. "Your house is beautiful," I said, taking in the details that spoke to Sarah's personality and interests. "It feels like you." "Thank you. It's taken me months to figure out how to arrange everything, but I think I'm finally starting to feel at home here." The kitchen table was set for two with simple white dishes and cloth napkins. Nothing fancy, but clearly prepared with care. A bottle of wine sat open on the counter, and whatever Sarah had been cooking smelled rich and inviting despite her claims about the recipe's cooperation. "Wine?" she asked, gesturing toward the bottle. "It's a local vintage that Janet recommended. I can't promise it's sophisticated, but it's supposed to pair well with experimental cooking disasters." "I'd love some," I said, accepting the glass she offered, and noting the slight tremor in her hand that suggested she was more nervous about this dinner than she was letting on. The meal turned out to be chicken with herbs and vegetables that had been roasted to golden perfection, accompanied by rice pilaf that showed only minor evidence of the struggles Sarah had described. It was delicious and comforting, the kind of food that spoke to genuine effort and care rather than culinary showmanship. "This is wonderful," I said after the first few bites. "What exactly did you think went wrong?" Sarah laughed, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "The recipe said to cook everything at 350 for 40 minutes, but my oven apparently runs hot, so I had to adjust on the fly. Then I forgot to start the rice until 20 minutes before you arrived, which led to some creative time management." "Well, your creative time management was definitely successful." We settled into dinner conversation that felt both natural and significant, the kind of talk that happens when two people are genuinely interested in understanding each other, beyond surface pleasantries. Sarah asked about my family background, my decision to take over my father's business, and my plans for expanding the company. I found myself sharing details about my goals and challenges that I rarely discussed with anyone, let alone clients. "What made you decide to keep the business name Rodriguez & Sons?" she asked. "Wouldn't Rodriguez Construction or something more general have made more sense?" "Honestly, I couldn't bring myself to change it," I said. "My dad was so proud of building something he could pass down to his children, even though he only had daughters. The sons part was always more about hope than reality, but changing it felt like erasing his dream." "That's beautiful," Sarah said softly. "Even if it occasionally confuses people who expect to meet someone named Rodriguez Jr., the confusion actually works in my favor sometimes. People make assumptions about who they're going to meet, and then I show up and they have to adjust their expectations. Do you face a lot of skepticism because of being a woman in construction? The question was one I'd answered many times before, but Sarah asked it with genuine curiosity, rather than the prurient interest some people showed when discussing gender dynamics in traditionally male industries. Less than I expected, actually, I said thoughtfully. Most clients care more about competence and reliability than gender, and word-of-mouth recommendations have helped establish credibility. Though there are definitely still people who assume I'm someone's assistant rather than the contractor. Like Margaret Walsh, Sarah said with a knowing look. Margaret Walsh and a few others. But honestly, those aren't usually the clients I want to work with anyway. People who make assumptions based on appearance tend to be difficult in other ways too. As dinner progressed, our conversation moved from professional topics to more personal territory. Sarah talked about her marriage and divorce with the kind of honest reflection that spoke to someone who had processed difficult experiences and emerged with insight rather than bitterness. The hardest part wasn't the actual divorce, she said, refilling our wine glasses. It was realizing how much of myself I'd lost in trying to be the person I thought he wanted me to be. When we separated, I had to figure out who I actually was when I wasn't defining myself in relation to someone else's expectations. Is that why you moved here, to figure that out? Partly, but also because I wanted a fresh start somewhere that didn't have 25 years of shared history embedded in every familiar place. She paused, considering her words. I needed space to discover what I actually wanted my life to look like, without the weight of all those accumulated compromises and adjustments. And what have you discovered? Sarah smiled, and there was something both vulnerable and determined in her expression. That I like making my own decisions, even when they're wrong. That I enjoy the process of creating a home that reflects my actual preferences, rather than some compromise between two people's different visions. And that I'm much braver than I gave myself credit for. Braver how? Well, she said, meeting my eyes directly. 3 months ago, I never would have had the courage to ask a virtual stranger whether age was just a number for marriage, or to invite someone I barely knew to dinner because I was interested in getting to know them better. The directness of her admission sent warmth spreading through my chest. Here was someone who was willing to acknowledge what was developing between us without playing games or hiding behind ambiguity. For what it's worth, I said, I think your courage is one of the most attractive things about you. Just one of them? Sarah asked, with a teasing smile that suggested she was fishing for more specific compliments. Well, there's also your intelligence, your kindness, the way you approach problems with both creativity and practicality, and your ability to make even furniture assembly feel like an adventure. Sarah laughed, but there was something pleased and a little shy in her expression that suggested my words had hit their intended mark. After dinner, we moved to the living room with our wine, settling on opposite ends of Sarah's comfortable sofa in a way that felt both intimate and appropriately careful. The evening light filtering through her windows cast everything in a warm glow that made the moment feel suspended outside normal time. Can I ask you something? Sarah said, curling her legs under her in a way that made her look younger and more relaxed than I'd seen her before. Always. What do you think about age differences in relationships? Not theoretically, but practically. Do you think they matter as much as people assume they do? The question was clearly significant, and I took a moment to consider my answer, carefully. I think they matter less than people assume, but probably more than we want to admit. The important thing isn't the number of years, but whether two people are in compatible places in their lives. What do you mean by compatible places? Similar levels of emotional maturity, complementary goals, shared values about what kind of relationship they want to build together. I paused, studying her face. Age can affect those things, but it's not the determining factor. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. When I was married, David and I were the same age, but we wanted completely different things. He was focused on maintaining status and meeting other people's expectations, while I was becoming more interested in authenticity and personal growth. Sometimes people grow in different directions, regardless of age. Exactly. And sometimes, she said, looking directly at me, you meet someone who's years younger, but approaches life with more wisdom and intentionality than people who've had decades more experience. The compliment was clear, and I felt myself blushing slightly under her direct gaze. That's very generous. It's also honest, Sarah said. Emma, I need to tell you something, and I hope it doesn't make you uncomfortable. My heart rate increased slightly, sensing that whatever came next would be significant. Okay. I'm attracted to you. Not just intellectually or as a friend, but genuinely, romantically attracted. And I know that complicates things because you're working on my driveway, and there's the age difference, and we've only known each other for a few days. But I also know that connections like this don't come along very often, and I don't want to pretend it's not happening just because the timing or circumstances aren't perfect. The honesty and vulnerability in her admission took my breath away. Here was someone willing to risk rejection and awkwardness to acknowledge what was developing between us. Someone brave enough to speak truthfully about her feelings rather than hoping I would somehow intuit them. Sarah, I said softly, I'm attracted to you too. More than I probably should be, given the professional relationship. But you're right about connections like this being rare. So what do we do about it? I think, I said carefully, that we keep being honest with each other about what we're feeling, and we see where it goes. The driveway project will be finished in a few days, which eliminates the professional complication, and the age difference only matters if we let it matter. Sarah smiled, and there was relief and hope in equal measure in her expression. I was hoping you'd say something like that. Were you worried I'd run away? A little. In my experience, most people prefer relationships that are simple and uncomplicated. What we're potentially starting is neither of those things. Maybe not, I said, but the best things in life usually aren't simple or uncomplicated. We talked until almost 11, exploring the practical and emotional implications of what we were acknowledging between us. Sarah was characteristically thoughtful about potential challenges, while also being clear about her genuine interest in seeing where our connection might lead. I found myself matching her honesty with my own, discussing my reservations and hopes with equal frankness. When I finally prepared to leave, Sarah walked me to the front door, and there was a moment of uncertainty about how to end the evening. We'd acknowledged our mutual attraction, but hadn't yet crossed the physical boundaries that separated friendship from something more romantic. Thank you for dinner, I said, standing in her doorway and looking into her eyes. And for being so honest about everything. Thank you for staying, and for being willing to explore this with me despite all the potential complications. There was a moment when we stood close enough that kissing would have been natural and expected, but instead, Sarah reached out and squeezed my hand gently. I don't want to rush anything, she said softly. I want to savor the process of getting to know you properly. I'd like that too, I said, squeezing her hand in return. Driving home that night, I found myself processing the significance of everything that had happened over dinner. Sarah Mitchell had proven herself to be someone who approached relationships with the same thoughtfulness and courage she brought to every other aspect of her life. And I was beginning to understand that what was developing between us had the potential to be something truly special. The practical challenges remained, but they felt manageable in the face of such genuine connection and mutual respect. Whatever came next, I was grateful for Sarah's willingness to acknowledge what was happening between us, and for her courage in suggesting we explore it honestly rather than pretending it didn't exist. Tomorrow would bring new conversations and new developments, but tonight I fell asleep thinking about the way Sarah had looked at me across her dinner table and the way her honesty had made me feel both seen and valued in ways I hadn't experienced in years. Friday morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of perfect spring day that made everything feel possible. I arrived at Sarah's house earlier than usual, partly because I was eager to complete the drainage work and begin the concrete pouring process, but mostly because I was looking forward to seeing her again after the previous evening's conversation. The honesty we'd shared over dinner had shifted something fundamental between us, and I found myself curious about how that change would manifest in the daylight hours of ordinary work. Sarah was already outside when I pulled up, but instead of working in her garden as had become her custom, she was sitting at the bistro table with a cup of coffee and what appeared to be a thick folder of papers. She wore jeans and a cream-colored sweater that made her look soft and approachable, and when she saw me climbing out of my truck, her smile was warm with the particular intimacy of shared secrets. "Good morning," she called out, standing up and walking over to greet me. You're early today. Couldn't sleep, I admitted. Too much thinking about drainage systems and concrete curing times. Sarah's smile became more knowing. Just drainage systems? Well, maybe a few other things too. We stood there for a moment, both of us apparently processing how to navigate this new territory we'd entered. The attraction and mutual interest were acknowledged now, but we hadn't yet established the practical boundaries of how to interact while I was still technically her contractor. Coffee? Sarah asked, gesturing toward the table. I made extra, and I have something I wanted to show you. The folders she'd been reviewing turned out to contain Jessica's research on sustainable landscaping, along with what appeared to be Sarah's own sketches and notes about potential garden improvements. The drawings were detailed and thoughtful, showing both artistic sensibility and practical consideration for things like water flow, sun exposure, and maintenance requirements. Sarah's smile was sharp and not entirely pleasant. I told him that my personal life was no longer his concern, that our children are adults who can form their own opinions about my choices, and that if he continued harassing me about my perfectly legal and appropriate activities, I would be speaking with my lawyer about modifying our divorce agreement. Good for you. I also may have mentioned that the contractor in question was a successful businesswoman who owned her own company and had been nothing but professional and competent throughout our working relationship. May have mentioned? Sarah's smile became more genuine. Okay, I definitely mentioned it. Possibly with some emphasis on your qualifications and my right to hire whomever I choose for my home improvement projects. We returned to work after that, but the encounter with David had shifted something in the atmosphere. Sarah seemed more determined and focused, as if his attempt at intimidation had crystallized her resolve to live life on her own terms. I found myself admiring her composure and her refusal to be bullied into defending decisions that were entirely within her rights to make. As the morning progressed, we worked side by side more collaboratively than we had on previous days. Sarah helped me organize materials, held equipment steady while I made adjustments, and asked questions that showed she was genuinely interested in understanding the technical aspects of the work. There was something both intimate and empowering about working together as partners, rather than maintaining the traditional contractor-client dynamic. Around noon, we were interrupted by the arrival of Tom and Janet, who appeared carrying a cooler, and wearing the kind of determined expressions that suggested they were on a mission. Lunch delivery, Janet announced, setting down the cooler and beginning to unpack what appeared to be enough food for a small party. Tom and I decided that people doing manual labor in the heat deserved proper sustenance. You didn't need to do that, Sarah protested, though she looked pleased by the gesture. Nonsense, Tom said, helping to set up an impromptu picnic on Sarah's front lawn. Besides, we wanted to check on Emma's progress and discuss our own drainage situation. The next hour passed in easy conversation and excellent food, with Tom and Janet proving to be exactly the kind of neighbors that made a community feel like home. They asked thoughtful questions about my work, shared stories about their own home improvement adventures, and treated both Sarah and me with the kind of genuine warmth that made clear their friendship was offered without conditions or judgment. We saw that David stopped by this morning, Janet said carefully, her tone neutral but her eyes watchful. Sarah's expression tightened slightly. He had some concerns about my recent activities that he felt compelled to share. I hope you told him where he could put his concerns, Tom said bluntly, earning a sharp look from his wife. Tom, Janet warned. What? The man has been divorced for over a year. He doesn't get to have opinions about Sarah's personal life anymore, especially not when those opinions are based on neighborhood gossip and outdated ideas about appropriate behavior. It's fine, Sarah said, though she looked grateful for Tom's indignation on her behalf. David's always been controlling, and divorce doesn't seem to have cured him of the belief that his opinion matters more than everyone else's. Well, for what it's worth, Janet said firmly. Anyone with eyes can see that Emma's work here is completely professional and exactly what this driveway needed. If David wants to manufacture drama where none exists, that says more about him than about either of you. After Tom and Janet left, promising to have us over for dinner the following week, Sarah and I found ourselves alone again, with the weight of everything that had happened that morning. The encounter with David had been unpleasant, but it had also clarified something important about Sarah's determination to live independently and her refusal to be controlled by other people's expectations. Thank you, Sarah said as we cleaned up the lunch remains. For what? For not making that encounter with David into something bigger than it needed to be. Some people would have used it as an excuse to back away from whatever this is between us. Sarah, I said, turning to face her directly. I'm not going anywhere because your ex-husband has opinions about your life. If anything, seeing how he tried to intimidate you makes me more determined to support whatever choices you want to make. Even if those choices are complicated? Especially if they're complicated. The afternoon flew by as we completed the final preparations for pouring the new concrete. The drainage system was properly installed, the base was level and compacted, and everything was ready for the culminating phase of the project. As I worked, I found myself thinking about the symbolic significance of what we were building together. The new driveway would be stronger and more durable than what had come before, designed to handle whatever weather and time might bring, built on a foundation that had been carefully prepared and thoughtfully planned. By late afternoon, we had reached the point where the project would be completed the following day. The concrete truck was scheduled to arrive first thing Monday morning, and after that, it would just be a matter of finishing work and final cleanup. The realization that our daily interactions were coming to an end created a bittersweet undercurrent to the satisfaction of work well done. So, Sarah said as I began loading my tools for the weekend, what happens after the driveway is finished? What do you want to happen? Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. I want to keep getting to know you. I want to explore whatever this connection is between us, without the complication of professional boundaries. I want to see if what I think is happening here is real and sustainable. And if it is, then I want to build something together that's as solid and well-planned as this driveway. Something designed to last. The sincerity in her voice and the hope in her expression did something warm and expansive to my chest. Here was someone willing to be completely honest about what she wanted, brave enough to invest in possibility despite the risks and complications involved. I want that too, I said, meaning it completely. More than I've wanted anything in a long time. So we're really doing this? Taking a chance on something that might be complicated and definitely won't be simple? We're really doing this. Sarah's smile was brilliant with relief and anticipation. Good. Because I have to tell you, Emma Rodriguez, you've completely disrupted my carefully planned quiet life, and I find that I'm grateful for the disruption. Just wait until you see what other disruptions I'm capable of. That evening, Sarah invited me to stay for dinner again, and this time the meal felt less like a tentative exploration and more like a celebration of decisions made and futures embraced. We talked about practical things like how to navigate the transition from professional to personal relationship, and about bigger questions like what we each hoped to build in our lives and how those hopes might align. The conversation was easy and wide-ranging, covering everything from Sarah's plans for the upcoming school year, to my goals for expanding the business to include more sustainable construction practices. Jessica's ideas are incredible, Sarah said, spreading the papers across the table so I could examine them properly. But I wanted to run them past you since you understand the drainage situation better than anyone. For the next 20 minutes, we reviewed the landscaping plans together, with Sarah explaining her daughter's recommendations and asking for my input on the technical feasibility of various improvements. It was the kind of collaborative planning that I usually only did with long-term clients, but Sarah approached it with the assumption that my opinion mattered, and my expertise was valuable beyond the immediate driveway project. The rain garden. Here would be perfect, I said, pointing to an area near the back fence where Jessica had proposed creating a depression to capture runoff. It would integrate beautifully with the drainage system I'm installing, and the native plants she's suggested would provide habitat while requiring minimal maintenance. What about this permeable paving idea for the back patio? Sarah asked, indicating another section of the plan. That's brilliant, actually. It would allow water infiltration while creating a functional, entertaining space. The initial cost is higher than traditional concrete, but the long-term benefits for water management make it worth considering. Sarah leaned closer to examine the technical details I was pointing out, and I became acutely aware of her proximity, the subtle scent of her perfume, and the way her hair caught the morning light. The attraction I'd acknowledged the night before felt more immediate and present in daylight, complicated by the professional context, but impossible to ignore. You know, Sarah said, apparently sensing the shift in atmosphere, it's going to Be strange when this project is finished, and you don't have a reason to be here every day. Is that your way of saying you'd like me to find reasons to come back? It's my way of saying that I've gotten used to having you around, and I'm not ready for that to end just because the driveway is complete. Before I could respond, the sound of a car door slamming interrupted the moment. We looked up to see a man in an expensive suit climbing out of a luxury sedan, his expression grim and his posture radiating the kind of authority that came from being accustomed to having his opinions matter more than other people's feelings. Sarah's face went pale, and she stood up abruptly, her entire body language shifting from relaxed to defensive in the space of a heartbeat. "David," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "What are you doing here?" The man Sarah had identified, as her ex-husband approached with the confident stride of someone who felt entitled to access and answers. He was handsome in a conventional way, probably in his early 50s, with graying hair and the kind of polished appearance that spoke of someone who spent considerable money on his image. "Sarah," he said, his gaze taking in the coffee setup, the scattered papers, and me with obvious calculation. "We need to talk. About the house, about your recent behavior, about the decisions you've been making." "I don't recall asking for your input on my decisions," Sarah replied, her voice remaining level despite the tension evident in her posture. David's attention shifted to me, his expression making it clear that he viewed my presence as both an intrusion and a confirmation of whatever suspicions had brought him here. "You must be the contractor," he said, his tone suggesting that contractor was synonymous with problem. "I'm David Mitchell, Sarah's ex-husband. I understand you've been spending quite a bit of time here." "Emma Rodriguez," I said, standing up and extending my hand in a gesture that was polite but not deferential. "I'm handling the driveway renovation." David shook my hand briefly, his grip designed to communicate dominance rather than courtesy. "Yes, I've heard about the extensive construction project. It seems like a significant investment for someone who may not be staying in the house long term." The implication was clear. David had opinions about Sarah's financial decisions, and possibly about her right to make them independently. I felt a surge of protective anger on her behalf, recognizing the subtle undermining tactics of someone who couldn't accept that their former partner had moved on without their permission or approval. "The drainage problems were extensive," I said, keeping my voice professional. "Addressing them properly protects the foundation and prevents much more expensive repairs down the road. It's exactly the kind of investment that makes sense for long-term homeownership." "And I suppose you'd be the expert on long-term planning," David said, his tone dripping with condescension. "David," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying a warning edge. "Emma is a licensed contractor with years of experience. Her expertise isn't up for debate." "Of course not," David said, though his expression suggested otherwise. "Sarah, could we speak privately? There are some financial matters we need to discuss that don't require an audience." Sarah's jaw tightened, and I could see her weighing her options. Part of her clearly wanted to refuse on principle, but another part seemed to recognize that this confrontation was inevitable and might be better handled without witnesses. "Give me 5 minutes," she said to me, her voice apologetic. "This won't take long." I nodded, though every instinct I had was screaming that leaving Sarah alone with someone who clearly felt entitled to control her decisions was a bad idea. "I'll be working on the drainage prep if you need anything." As Sarah and David walked toward the house, I could hear the beginning of their conversation, David's voice taking on the patronizing tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a child. I forced myself to focus on my work, but it was impossible to ignore the occasional raised voice or the defensive edge in Sarah's responses. After what felt like much longer than 5 minutes, I heard the front door slam and the sound of David's car starting. Sarah reappeared a few moments later, her face flushed and her hands shaking slightly with what looked like suppressed anger. "I'm sorry about that," she said, sitting down heavily at the bistro table. "David has some very strong opinions about my life choices, and he's not particularly good at keeping them to himself." "What did he want?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, staring at her hands. "He's heard rumors about me entertaining male visitors and wanted to express his concern about how that might reflect on our children. Apparently, some mutual friends have been reporting back to him about my activities." The revelation that David was having Sarah monitored and judged sent a cold fury through my chest. The idea that a grown woman couldn't have contractors working on her house without it being interpreted as scandalous behavior was both absurd and infuriating. "That's completely out of line," I said, meaning it absolutely. "David's always been concerned with appearances and what other people think." During our marriage, he micromanaged everything from my wardrobe choices to my social interactions to make sure nothing reflected poorly on his professional reputation. And now? Now he seems to think that because we share children, he still has the right to monitor and approve of my personal life. Sarah's voice carried a mixture of exhaustion and determination. He suggested that I was having some kind of midlife crisis and making poor decisions that could embarrass Jessica and Michael. "What did you tell him?" There was something deeply satisfying about talking with someone who understood that building anything worthwhile required both vision and patience, planning and flexibility. As the evening wound down, we found ourselves back on Sarah's front porch, looking out at the nearly completed driveway and the garden that was beginning to show signs of spring growth. The neighborhood was quiet except for the distant sound of children playing and the occasional car passing by on its way to weekend destinations. "You know," Sarah said, settling into the porch swing and patting the space beside her. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be sitting here planning a future with someone I met through a construction project, I would have thought they were completely delusional." "What would you have been planning instead?" I asked, sitting down beside her and noting how natural it felt when she leaned slightly against my shoulder. "Honestly, I probably wouldn't have been planning much of anything beyond getting through each day and figuring out how to be alone, without being lonely. The idea of opening my life to someone new felt impossible and terrifying." "What changed?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I think I finally realized that being alone and being lonely are two completely different things. I can be perfectly content with my own company, but that doesn't mean I don't want to share my life with someone who adds to it, rather than requiring me to diminish myself." "And you think I add to your life?" "Emma," Sarah said, turning to look at me directly. "You've made me remember what it feels like to be seen and appreciated for exactly who I am. You've shown me that I can be completely honest about my thoughts and feelings without having to worry about whether they're convenient or appropriate. You've reminded me that I'm capable of building something beautiful when I have the right partner." The words hit me with unexpected force, partly because they were so genuine, and partly because they reflected exactly how I felt about the impact Sarah had had on my own life. She had shown me what it looked like to approach relationships with courage and authenticity, to risk vulnerability in service of connection, to believe that age and circumstances were less important than compatibility and mutual respect. "Sarah," I said softly, "I think we're going to build something incredible together." "I think so too." As we sat together in the gathering dusk, watching the lights come on in windows up and down Oakwood Drive, I found myself thinking about foundations and permanence, about the difference between structures built quickly and those designed to last. What Sarah and I were beginning felt solid and well-planned, based on honest communication and shared values rather than convenience or superficial attraction. The next few months would bring new challenges and discoveries as we navigated the transition from contractor and client to whatever we were becoming. There would be questions about timing and logistics, about how to blend our established lives and independent routines, about whether the connection we'd discovered over concrete and conversation could sustain the ordinary realities of ongoing relationship. But sitting there with Sarah's warmth against my shoulder and her hand in mine, those future challenges felt manageable and even exciting. We had proven already that we could work together to solve problems, that we could be honest about our fears and hopes, that we could support each other through difficult moments without losing sight of our individual strength and autonomy. Monday morning would bring the concrete truck and the completion of the driveway project that had started this entire journey. But it would also mark the beginning of something new and full of possibility, something we were choosing to build, together with the same care and attention to detail that had characterized our work on Sarah's foundation. The best construction projects, I had learned from my father, weren't just about fixing what was broken or building something functional. They were about creating structures that could support whatever life brought, designed with both current needs and future dreams in mind. As I looked at the woman beside me and thought about the foundation we were laying together, I knew we were building something designed to last. The concrete would cure over the next few days, growing stronger with time and settling into its permanent form. But what Sarah and I had discovered in each other felt like it was already strong enough to support whatever we chose to build on top of it. And that, I thought, was the best kind of foundation anyone could ask for. October arrived in Maplewood Heights, with the kind of crisp clarity that made everything feel renewed and purposeful. The maple trees lining Oakwood Drive had transformed into torches of amber and scarlet, and Sarah's garden had settled into its autumn rhythm with late-blooming asters and the satisfied abundance of a growing season well tended. I pulled into the driveway I'd rebuilt 6 months earlier, noting with professional satisfaction how perfectly it had weathered its first winter and summer, the drainage system performing exactly as designed through spring floods and summer storms. Sarah's house had become as familiar as my own apartment, maybe more so. I had a key now, and coffee waiting for me most mornings when I stopped by before heading to other job sites. The front garden had evolved under Sarah's careful attention into something that belonged in design magazines, while the backyard had been transformed, according to Jessica's sustainable landscaping plan, into a model of environmental stewardship and natural beauty. This morning was different, though. Today marked exactly 6 months since the concrete truck had delivered the final pour for Sarah's driveway. And we'd decided to celebrate the anniversary with something neither of us had quite worked up the courage to discuss directly, but both understood was significant. Sarah had taken a personal day from teaching, and I'd cleared my schedule completely, telling Marcus that I had important business to attend to that couldn't be rescheduled. Sarah was waiting for me on the front porch when I arrived, wearing a dress I'd never seen before in deep blue that brought out the silver in her hair and made her look elegant and festive. She held 2 cups of coffee and had that particular smile that meant she was pleased about something she wasn't quite ready to reveal. "Good morning, anniversary girl," I said, climbing the porch steps and accepting the coffee she offered. "You look beautiful." "Thank you. I may have spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing what to wear for our big announcement day." "Nervous?" "Terrified and excited in equal measure," Sarah admitted. "Though I think that's probably appropriate for what we're about to do." We'd spent weeks planning this day, discussing timing and logistics, and the best way to share news that would surprise exactly no one who'd been paying attention, but still felt momentous to us. Sarah had invited her children to visit for the weekend, while I'd asked my sister Maria to drive down from Portland with her family. The gathering would be small but meaningful, including the people whose opinions mattered most to both of us. "Any second thoughts?" I asked, settling beside her on the porch swing that had become our unofficial thinking spot for major conversations. "About which part? Moving in together officially, announcing our engagement, or hosting both our families for the first time?" "Any of it. All of it." Sarah was quiet for a moment, sipping her coffee and watching the neighborhood wake up around us. Mrs. Chen was already in her garden, probably giving unsolicited advice to her tomato plants. Tom was loading fishing gear into his truck for what had become his Saturday morning ritual. Margaret Walsh was notably absent, having moved to a retirement community in August after deciding that Oakwood Drive had become too eclectic for her tastes. "No second thoughts," Sarah said finally. "Maybe some anxiety about logistics and whether Jessica will approve of the ring you chose, but no second thoughts about the fundamental decisions." The ring had been a joint project, designed by Sarah and crafted by a local jeweler who specialized in custom work. It was elegant and unique, featuring a stone the color of autumn leaves set in recycled gold, with an inscription inside that read "Built to Last" in letters so small only Sarah and I would ever know they were there. "Jessica's going to love it," I said confidently. "She helped me pick out the stone, remember? I still can't believe you managed to coordinate with both my children without me knowing. How did you even get Michael to keep a secret?" "I may have bribed him with the promise of introducing him to Marcus, who knows people in the Portland art scene." Sarah laughed, leaning against my shoulder in the easy way that had become natural over the months of learning each other's rhythms and preferences. "You're very good at strategic planning. It's all about understanding the foundation and building from there." The morning passed quickly as we prepared for our guests. Sarah bustled around the kitchen, preparing what she insisted on calling engagement lunch, despite the fact that the actual proposal hadn't happened yet. I focused on outdoor preparations, setting up additional seating in the back garden and making sure the sound system was working for the playlist Sarah had created, specifically for the occasion. Around 11, cars began arriving in rapid succession. Jessica pulled up first, followed immediately by Michael's ancient Honda that somehow continued running, despite making sounds that suggested imminent mechanical failure. My sister Maria arrived with her husband and 2 daughters, who immediately began exploring Sarah's garden with the focused intensity of children discovering a new playground. The introductions went smoother than I'd dared hope. Jessica and Michael approached the meeting with Sarah's characteristic thoughtfulness, asking genuine questions about my family and sharing stories that painted a picture of Sarah as both a devoted mother and an independent woman who'd raised them to think for themselves. Maria, who'd been skeptical about the age difference until she met Sarah, was won over within minutes by Sarah's combination of warmth and intelligence. "I can see why Emma fell for you," Maria said to Sarah as we gathered around the lunch table Sarah had set up in the back garden. "You're exactly the kind of person she needs, someone who appreciates her competence and doesn't try to change her." "Your sister is remarkable," Sarah replied. "I feel incredibly lucky that a driveway repair brought us together." "Mom's been different since she met Emma," Michael observed, serving himself salad from the impressive spread Sarah had prepared. "Happier, but also more herself, if that makes sense." "It makes perfect sense," Jessica agreed. "I was worried after the divorce that Mom would either isolate completely or try to become someone else to fit what she thought people wanted. Instead, she found someone who likes exactly who she already is." The conversation flowed easily as lunch progressed, with family stories and gentle teasing that showed everyone was making an effort to welcome each other into an expanded sense of belonging. Sarah's children shared embarrassing childhood memories, while Maria regaled the table with tales of my various business disasters and construction mishaps. "Emma once spent 3 hours trying to level a patio that kept having mysterious low spots," Maria said, grinning at me across the table. Turned out the homeowner's cat had been burying things underneath it during the night shift. "It was toys," I said defensively. "Little toy mice that the cat was apparently stockpiling for winter." "The point is," Maria continued, "she doesn't give up when things get complicated. She figures out what's wrong and fixes it properly." After lunch, as the afternoon settled into the golden light that made autumn feel like a gift, I caught Sarah's eye across the garden where she was showing my nieces how to identify different types of leaves. She nodded slightly, the signal we'd agreed upon, and I felt my heart rate increase with anticipation and nerves. "Everyone," I said, standing up from the picnic table and immediately regretting how formal my voice sounded. "Sarah and I have something we'd like to share with you." The conversation quieted, and I could see recognition dawning on faces around the table. Jessica started smiling before I'd even continued speaking, while Michael leaned forward with obvious anticipation. "6 months ago," I began, my voice steadying as I found my rhythm. "I thought I was just going to fix a driveway. Instead, I met someone who changed everything I thought I knew about building something lasting." Sarah moved to stand beside me, taking my hand with the kind of natural grace that made even this formally orchestrated moment feel authentic and right. "We've decided," Sarah said, picking up the thread of explanation, "that we want to make this partnership official. We want to build a life together that's as solid and well-planned as the foundation Emma created for this house." I reached into my pocket and withdrew the ring box, feeling the weight of the moment and the eyes of everyone who mattered to us. "Sarah Mitchell," I said, dropping to one knee on the patio we'd built together earlier that summer. "Will you marry me?" Sarah's smile was radiant as she extended her hand. "Yes, Emma Rodriguez. I thought you'd never ask." The ring fit perfectly, catching the afternoon light and looking exactly right on Sarah's hand. The gathering erupted in cheers and congratulations with hugs and happy tears, and the kind of celebration that felt both intimate and joyful. "I knew it," Jessica said, hugging both of us simultaneously. "I've been waiting for this since the first time I saw you two working together. You complement each other perfectly." "About time," Michael added, though his grin made it clear he was delighted rather than impatient. "Mom's been happier these past 6 months than I've seen her in years." Maria pulled me aside while the others continued celebrating. "She's perfect for you," she said quietly. "I can see how much you both bring out the best in each other." You approve? I more than approve. I'm grateful that you found someone who sees how amazing you are and isn't intimidated by your competence. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of planning conversations and family bonding. Sarah's children and my sister compared notes on our respective quirks and habits, while my nieces adopted Sarah as their new favorite adult and appointed themselves chief wedding planners, despite being 8 and 10 years old. "We need flowers everywhere," announced my younger niece, Sophia, "and a cake shaped like a driveway." "A driveway cake?" Sarah asked, clearly delighted by the suggestion. "With little construction trucks on it," added Emma, my older niece. "And maybe some concrete that's actually gray frosting." But as evening approached and our families began preparing to leave, promising to return soon for more detailed wedding planning, Sarah and I found ourselves alone again on the front porch. The day had been perfect, but I was looking forward to the quiet intimacy of processing it together. "So," Sarah said, settling into the porch swing and admiring her ring in the fading light, "we're really doing this. Getting married, combining households, becoming a family. Any regrets now that it's official?" "Only that it took us 6 months to make it official," Sarah said, leaning against my shoulder. "Though I suppose we needed that time to build the foundation properly." "Speaking of foundations," I said, "have you thought about what you want to do with your classroom after we're married? Maria mentioned that you've been considering a sabbatical." Sarah had been offered the opportunity to take a year off from teaching to pursue her own artistic work, a dream she'd set aside during her marriage but was now reconsidering as part of her commitment to living authentically. "I'm leaning toward taking it," she said. "The timing feels right, and I have some ideas for projects that would combine my art background with environmental themes. Jessica's been encouraging me to apply for grants to do community art installations focused on sustainability." That sounds incredible, and financially, with the business doing well and my expanding into commercial projects, we could definitely manage on one income for a year. "It's strange," Sarah mused, "how different it feels to make decisions with someone who actually wants to support my dreams rather than redirect them towards something more conventional." "David never supported your art?" "David saw my art as a hobby that was fine as long as it didn't interfere with my real responsibilities or cost too much money. The idea that I might want to pursue it seriously, or that it might be valuable in its own right, never occurred to him." "His loss is my gain," I said, squeezing her hand. "I can't wait to see what you create when you have the time and freedom to follow your vision." As full darkness settled over the neighborhood, we moved inside to begin the practical process of combining our lives more formally. Sarah had already unofficially moved many of her belongings into my apartment, while I'd established a semi-permanent presence in her house. The engagement made it official. We would live primarily at Sarah's house, which had more space and a better setup for entertaining, while keeping my apartment as a home office and workshop space. "Have you thought about what you want the wedding to look like?" Sarah asked as we settled on her couch with tea and the comfortable exhaustion that comes from a day of significant emotional milestones. "Honestly, I've been so focused on the proposal that I haven't thought much beyond that." "What do you want?" "Something small and meaningful," Sarah said without hesitation. "Family, close friends, maybe here in the garden since this is where everything started. I had the big traditional wedding the first time, and it was more about spectacle than celebration." "That sounds perfect. Though we should probably warn Jessica and Michael that their wedding planning responsibilities are about to become very real. Jessica's already texted me 3 times with ideas since everyone left. Apparently she's been researching sustainable wedding options just in case." "Of course she has." We spent the next hour making preliminary lists and discussing logistics, but mostly just enjoying the reality of being engaged and officially committed to building a future together. The practical details felt manageable because the emotional foundation was so solid, built through months of honest communication and demonstrated compatibility. "Can I tell you something?" Sarah said as we prepared for bed in the routine that had become natural, despite officially living in separate spaces. "Always. This afternoon when you were proposing, I had this moment of complete clarity about how right this decision is. Not just because I love you, though I do, but because of how natural it feels to plan a life with you." "Natural how?" "Natural like we want the same things and approach problems the same way. Like we're building towards something together rather than trying to convince each other to want different things." I know exactly what you mean, I said. It feels like we're designing the life we want, rather than settling for what seems practical or expected. That night, as we lay in Sarah's bed looking out at the garden we'd planned together and the driveway that had started everything, I found myself thinking about foundations and permanence, about the difference between structures built quickly and those designed to last generations. What Sarah and I had built together felt solid and well-engineered, based on honest communication and shared values rather than convenience or desperation. We'd taken the time to understand each other's strengths and challenges, to test our compatibility under various circumstances, to make sure we were choosing each other for the right reasons. The wedding would be in the spring, we'd decided, when Sarah's garden would be at its most beautiful and the weather would be perfect for an outdoor celebration. Jessica had already volunteered to handle logistics with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting months for official wedding planning permission, while Michael had offered to create a multimedia art installation as his contribution to the ceremony. My business was thriving, with more projects than I could handle, and a reputation that had spread through word-of-mouth recommendations from satisfied clients like Tom and Janet, who'd become not just customers, but genuine friends. Sarah's sabbatical application had been approved, and she'd already begun sketching ideas for community art projects that would combine her artistic vision with environmental advocacy. But beyond the practical successes and future plans, what felt most significant was the sense of having found someone who enhanced rather than constrained my sense of possibility. Sarah had shown me what it looked like to approach relationships with courage and authenticity, to risk vulnerability in service of genuine connection, to believe that age and circumstances were less important than compatibility and mutual respect. "Emma," Sarah whispered in the darkness, her voice soft with approaching sleep. Thank you for fixing my driveway. Thank you for asking the right questions." "What questions?" "Whether age is just a number for marriage, whether second chances are possible, whether someone could build something lasting with you. And the answers?" "The answers," I said, pulling her closer, "are yes, yes, and absolutely yes." 6 months earlier, I'd thought I was just repairing cracked concrete and poor drainage. Instead, I'd discovered that the most important construction projects aren't always the ones you can see from the street. Sometimes the most valuable work happens in the spaces between people, in the careful excavation of old assumptions and the thoughtful installation of new possibilities. Sarah's driveway had needed a complete rebuild, from foundation to finish, designed to handle whatever weather and time might bring. What we'd built together felt equally solid, equally permanent, equally prepared for whatever the future might hold. The concrete had cured exactly as planned, growing stronger with time and settling into its permanent form. And what Sarah and I had discovered in each other had done the same, deepening from initial attraction into something durable and dependable, beautiful and functional, built to last. As I drifted off to sleep in the house that had become our home, with the ring I'd given Sarah catching moonlight on the nightstand and plans for our future taking shape in both our minds, I understood that sometimes the best foundations are the ones you never see coming. The ones that start with simple questions and honest answers, and grow into something neither person expected but both are brave enough to build together. The driveway would probably outlast us both, a testament to proper preparation and quality materials. But what we'd built on top of that foundation, in the space between concrete and possibility, felt like it was designed for forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.